Can you guys see that?
There it is.
Okay, yeah, I think I hit the wrong button the first time. Apologies.
Yep.
So
Nope, I can see a slide deck now.
I know that you guys have other stuff on your agenda. Shevik said shooting for about a half hour, so I was thinking I'll try. I'm sure I can get through what I have to say in 15 minutes. I'm gonna ask because, well, it's a pretty small group, so if we need to break out for questions, we can do that. I may need to do a little scrolling through the slide deck to help answer the questions. I had planned to ask you to hold some certain comments, so I may still do that just for purposes of getting through it. And then happy to answer any questions. And I'm sort of helping support this study as one of our principal planners. I probably, if you have very technical questions, I can probably answer them, but worst case scenario, I'll make a note of them. And then I can work with Shevik to get answers to those questions back to you. But what I thought I'd do, go through, give you a quick overview of the study. There's 2 phases to the study, and we're partway through the first phase. So that's important to remember. You know, we don't anticipate finishing this up before probably the full study, both phases, until probably towards the end of next year. But that is what we're doing. So I'm part of the project team. We have 2 great young planners, Emma Sigworth and Michael Wade. If you guys haven't had a chance to meet them, I hope you do. I know Shevik has met them. They're both really talented, really smart, and doing a great job on this. I'm, as I mentioned, helping to support it along with our director, Luis Pereira, who is former planner at the city, came back in a role as PD planning director, which is fantastic. Oops. Here we go. All right. So the basics, why are we doing this study? There are a lot of reasons. Many of them have to do with these things that don't have a box around them. We know that there are low rental vacancy rates, lots of problems with household cost burden. This is not new, but it's certainly gotten worse for various reasons in recent years. We are also anticipating, you know, if we accommodate community growth, that's part of what we do. For those who don't know, you know, we have a comprehensive plan that's required under state law, and then we work with the Met Council, who does what they call growth forecasts, which are a magic stew of projections and some other factors, but tend to work pretty well for inner city. So we're trying to accommodate that growth, and this is part of that, with a little bit different strategies than we did with our previous comprehensive plan. And then again, the city's housing charge, but more housing choice. If you heard the term missing middle, that's something we're looking at. We have a lot of single family in St. Paul. Something around 70% of the residential land is single family zoned. And then more recently, we have a lot of larger apartment buildings, which are great, but we have less of that traditional sort of in the middle type of housing. I also put 2 things in a box, and that's because I want to really emphasize these. All these other factors are things that we think about all the time as a city, both in the planning function and elsewhere. But this study is also being prompted by 2 things. One is our 2040 comprehensive plan, approved document guiding the city, has legal weight. And some of the policies in that are to, again, you know, I said we have a lot of single family. In our previous comprehensive plan, we focused on allowing for more density along those corridors that have really good transit service. You know, think about the Green Line, think about the B line that runs along Snelling. There are other transit lines coming. And then there are, you know, sort of things that aren't BRT or LRT, but provide good transit service. This comprehensive plan, amongst other things, talks about how can we accommodate a little bit more housing variety in some of our neighborhoods, not necessarily everywhere, but doing that in addition to those other things we do. It also is in response to a city council resolution that specifically asked the planning commission, which is staffed by PD planning staff, to look at ways to increase housing choice, housing availability, you know, and that was in part spurred by, you know, the acknowledgement that there's really is a housing crisis, not just in St. Paul, but many places. So what can we do on the zoning and planning side to address that? And I have a few more comments on, how that intersects with some of the other things the city might do. So this, I won't spend too much time. It's there in the recording if you want to pause it, but it cites some of the comprehensive plan policies as well as some language from that city council resolution 18-1204. And those are all things, if you go to St. Paul for All, I believe you can either type out FOR or the number 4. It should bring you to the comp plan. If you can't find it there, just go to stpaul.gov and Google it. You should be able to find it. The resolution, it may be available on one of our facts, which I believe Shevik provided a link to in the agenda. If not, I guess I can dig up a copy for you guys, or you can, if you're savvy with Legistar, you can find it in the past city council agendas. All right, so I mentioned there's a phase 1 and a phase 2. The idea of doing a phase 1 and phase 2 came up as we started this and realized sort of as staff and working with the members of the planning commission, kind of the scope and scale of what we were taking on. So there was some desire to look at some of the things that we could do that might be called low-hanging fruit. They don't require massive changes to the code. They shouldn't have huge impacts, certainly not in the short term. And that's something I hope to touch on later, sort of this difference between land use and zoning. They're not the same. Zoning controls land use, but land use changes much more slowly than zoning might, I guess would be the tagline there. So there are some phase 1 things. We wanted to look at smaller homes. So I'm sure people have heard of the idea of tiny homes. Our zoning code has some restrictions on minimum width of structures and other things that make some of those things harder. So we wanted to look at ways we could do that and still be consistent with building code requirements, because zoning is not really the only thing that controls the size of a structure. There are minimum square footages in a unit per person, per occupant. There are things in zoning code that relate to, sort of how you can construct a building to make sure it's, will stand up to wind and other things. So we have consulted with other folks on that. We wanted to look at allowing more than one residential building per lot. This is a place, allow me to explain that before you ask questions, and I'll do that in a couple slides. We're also looking at some things related to accessory dwelling units and on smaller lots than they're currently allowed, as well as allowing larger sized accessory dwelling units. In phase 2, we're going to go out, take a broader look at things like, are there places in the city where we don't currently allow things like duplexes or even triplexes, that it might make sense to allow those. That also includes things like townhomes and cluster development, sort of different forms of development. Even maybe looking at, are there places where fourplexes might be appropriate? Some of the tools for doing this are looking at things like dimensional standards. So right now, we have setback requirements, we have maximum lot coverage requirements, we have lot size and width standards. So and I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute. So that sort of restricts what you can build. Also, are there ways that we can use the zoning code to incentivize affordable housing? Obviously, one of the biggest challenges with the housing crisis is there's only so many public resources available. So what can we do to make it easier and in fact encourage private property developers to build affordable housing? In terms of, oops, I did not put this together, so I've run through it, but I was expecting a different slide next. Big part of this is engagement. That includes both folks such as yourself, residents, property owners in St. Paul, as well as some technical experts. We've gone to other district councils. We anticipate going to more. We've done some webinars where we've invited folks. We have tried to get out to events over the summer, such as Safe Summer Nights, for example. We do have a project website. Again, I think Setback provided a link to that. If not, let me know at the end and I'll see if I can find it. We are hoping to do some more focused outreach, particularly as we go into phase 2, using things like surveys that really draw people in and get them to provide comments in ways that we might not otherwise get. We're also trying to work with some of the existing groups out there, whether it be a culturally based or kind of sort of community service organization, in addition to the district councils, advocacy groups, business groups, all sort of any point of contact where we can let people know what's happening and get some feedback. And that's, of course, in addition to the formal processes that exist for any sort of zoning study or ordinance change that the city looks at. And I'll talk about those as well. The other piece is a technical expert. We did put together a technical advisor committee, so we're working with both some profit and not-for-profit developers who do work in this space. So we have a guy who works with Habitat for Humanity. We have some private developers who do sort of smaller affordable housing projects, not necessarily subsidized. We talked to some financial professionals who do development financing to make sure we're understanding sort of the options that are out there. We are also working with our own housing team and the folks over at Department of Safety and Inspections who really have that expertise in building code and all those things. And then we did actually also contract with a team. It's 2 individuals, Neil Heller and Jim Kuman, who have a lot of experience and offer these services in sort of urban design and understanding financial implications. And they're helping us look at things like, okay, if you have a given lot size, knowing building requirements where it sort of makes sense, from a cost perspective, you sort of need to do a minimum width of a building in some cases if you're going to do multiple units, and comparing those things against sort of our current code requirements and things that we might change. Or when I say change, I mean that staff might identify potential changes for, review by the Planning Commission, the City Council, and the public, and also understanding the financial side. When we as staff started working on this, one of the first things we did was have a conversation with, the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Committee of the Planning Commission, and a lot of that conversation revolved around, things like equity. So, if we allow duplexes in more places, who benefits from that, right? Is it people coming in and building duplexes that they're going to rent out? Is it people who want to come in and convert an existing structure to a duplex and use the rent that they will get from the second unit to help cover their mortgage? Sort of understanding those things and implications. Obviously, we can't control every factor, but we want to get a better sense of how the zoning side of things might play out. The other part of that conversation is what other tools are there, and some of them are the city, some of them are dealing with sort of societal inequities like lack of access to capital for members of certain communities, or not having the an understanding or experience with how city approval processes work or what might be needed to make a project go. So those are all things we're thinking about. So I got to tab back to the correct screen again. Okay, so this is a rough schedule. We're right about here right now. And in fact, I was at a meeting earlier tonight where I'm going to highlight some of the stuff that happened there in a few minutes. But so in terms of the phase 1 changes, which I'm going to review what's being recommended at this point in a moment, a public hearing was held by the Planning Commission on October 15th. The next step is for the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Committee. That's the working committee of the Planning Commission. They looked at that public hearing feedback tonight. They're going to send some recommendations on to the full Planning Commission. The full Planning Commission, then they don't take any additional public input at this step, but the full Planning Commission will debate exactly what they want to recommend, and then that recommendation will go on to the city council. Right now, we're looking at around December, sometime in December, for the city council to, put potential zoning changes on their agenda, and then have our sort of standard legally required ordinance review process. So that would include a public hearing, multiple readings. In this case, it's not what we call quasi-judicial. Sometimes there are restrictions around things like appeals, for example, that council members are more restricted in what they can do in terms of meeting with folks. This is a legislative matter, so you have a chance to obviously reach out to your council member if that's something you wanted to do. And then there'd be another hearing there. And that would be where the decision would be made on any phase 1 amendments. Phase 2, as I said earlier, that's going to continue for a while. We're going to continue with our engagement activities through at least spring. Based on that, we're going to, we as staff working with the Planning Commission will start drafting some additional proposed amendments. And then that phase 2 would go through the same process. So it goes to a Planning Commission committee. It then goes to the full Planning Commission. They release any recommendations that they agree on for a public hearing. That public hearing is held. The comments received are taken back. Staff helps go through those comments, sort of organize them, pull out themes, and then work with the city and Comprehensive Neighborhood Planning Committee to develop a revised as needed set of recommendations that goes back to the full Planning Commission. And then they, based on discussion, forward it to the city council, and there's another hearing there. So I guess the top line takeaway would be that we're pretty early in the process still. And there are still lots of opportunities for both sort of informal, engagement with staff, with others, in addition to the formal approval processes. So that's sort of where we are in terms of schedule. So how are we doing on time?
I think you're doing okay, Josh.
Okay, so these are the proposed phase 1 amendments. I do want to highlight this one. Oops, silly me. I added this bullet point at the end. This is about owner occupancy requirement for ADUs. And I'm going to talk about that one in particular because that was something that happened tonight. But I have some slides on some of these other things. I particularly want to talk about B. I mentioned that earlier, and then some of the ADU changes. And then I don't have a slide for this, but I can talk about that as well when we're talking about the ADUs. So, but there are some other things. We looked at things like setback, the distance between buildings on a zoning lot. It's currently 12 feet. Zoning code, or excuse me, building code's going to keep it probably around 10 feet, but we didn't see, that's a thing where you could potentially make it a little bit easier to accommodate additional development on a lot. And there are some other things that are really minor amendments. One of them deals with our duplex triplex conversion guidelines, which is really an internal thing. And then the student housing overlay around the University of St. Thomas. So minimum lot, we talked about this, or I talked about this a little bit. There are ways to build houses that are a little bit narrower. That could help. We do have places in the city where we have narrower lots. And so that could help with setback variances on the side or potentially elsewhere. And reduce the need for variances. I'm not sure what the variance was tonight. Was it a setback variance? There you go. So this would be more likely to affect a side setback variance. But the other impact is, if folks are familiar with a cottage court, it's a pretty classic style housing. There are a few examples in St. Paul. There's some on Grand, as well as on, I think, Cleveland. Where you have smaller units that are sort of clustered around a central court. It can help provide affordable housing just because they're generally smaller units, and provide an alternative, to say just a single family home. This I wanted to highlight because this has been a point of confusion. So currently, there are multiple things that impact what you can do on an RL through RT1. So RL, if you can see through R4, are sort of our standard single family zoning districts. Most of the city is R4 and R3, more R4 than R3. RL is really only down in the Highwood area, down 61 along the Mississippi, and R1 and R2 is in some pretty limited areas. But all those districts have sort of some commonalities. They have, you need a minimum lot area per unit, you need a minimum lot width, and then there are some setbacks. So, you know, RL, this is designed to be essentially almost rural. You need a 21,000 square foot lot. So that's like 4.5 standard lots, sort of depending on how big your lot is. We do count the area of the alley. So 4.5, 5 lots. R4 is more of a typical city lot. So if you have a 120 by 40 foot lot, we count the alley in that square footage, so you can typically get to that 5,000 minimum. What this requirement would do would simply take away not any of these requirements, but it would simply say you can build 2 buildings. So if you're on an R4 lot and your house is, say, built instead of on one side, it's built in the middle, so you can't really split your lot because it would go right down the middle of your house. It would allow you to build a second building somewhere on the lot. Now, there are lots of questions about how does the ownership structure work? You know, if you're going to rent it, that's another thing. So there are some questions that we're still thinking about, but it would essentially allow better utilization of large lots. It would not allow someone who has a standard 5,000 foot-ish R4 lot to build an additional unit. They would have to have a 10,000 square foot lot. And that's this final column over here, and 80 feet of width. So essentially they'd already have to have 2 lots. And that's how that was designed. Now, phase 2 is going to look a little more closely at other ways we can accommodate it, but that's the idea there. So I apologize if I was a little bit, I don't know what the word would be, but this is, when we've talked about this before, people have sort of said, wait, 2 lots, 2 buildings on a lot. Well, yes, but you have to have a really large lot. It's really no different than our current standards in terms of the overall density. So in terms of ADUs, we already have a number of standards that regulate ADUs. They can only occupy a certain percentage of the yard. They can only be of a certain size. The phase 1 amendments propose increasing that a little bit. And some of them, there are also limits on the maximum size. It's hard to explain why these two are both things. There's also the difference between something like between an ADU and something like a duplex. A duplex is 2 primary units. So the definition of a household in the city is up to 6 unrelated adults. If you had a duplex, that's 2 units, up to 12 people. If you have a single family home with an ADU, that's up to 6. So if you have a family of, and dependents don't count. So, you know, if you had, let's say, you know, mom and dad, grandma or grandpa, so 3 adults and 2 kids, you could then have another 3 adults in an ADU versus 6 if it were a fully separate unit. And that 6, so that's something that went through recently. The changes would essentially allow smaller lots where it was still appropriate to have an interior attached ADU. But again, and it would allow, because as this bottom thing points out, if you have an 800 square foot ADU, it can legally only have, I'd have to go and look at the numbers, but the Minnesota Residential Code and Fire Code limits the number of people. So regardless of what the city says, you can only have so many people living there because you need a minimum amount of square footage per person, and I forget what that number is. So these changes would allow, if you do happen to have a larger lot with a larger primary structure, you could build, as it shows over here, a larger unit, which might provide housing for 1 or 2 more people, should the property owner decide to build that. We also added a little accessibility, flexibility in design by allowing a little bit more square footage of lot area. But again, there are still these limits on occupancy and on how much of the rear yard it can cover. All right, so questions. Let me go back because I did want to cover this. So, oops. Sorry. So at the bottom of my screen, this is new. So when the city embarked on this study, the idea of so currently the city requires, if you want to build an ADU on your single family lot, whether it's attached, internal, or detached, you have to be the owner occupying the primary unit. So if you have a house that you rent out, you cannot build an ADU. And so if someone wants to build an ADU, there's a process they fill out, essentially a document with the city that says, I live here and I'm going to continue living here. And then the Department of Safety Inspections checks up on that annually. And that's that. There was at the time of the original adoption of the ADU ordinance, which was 4 or 5 years ago, in that range, there was some discussion of whether owner occupancy made sense. Ultimately, that is what was passed by the city. There was always as part of this larger 1 to 4 unit zoning study, both phases, there was going to be some consideration of whether or not that owner occupancy requirement should be removed. The initial recommendation from staff was that that's something we'd look at in phase 2 of the study. Based on the amount of comments that were received, really urging a stronger look at removing that owner occupancy requirement, the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Committee voted today to make a recommendation to the full Planning Commission that be included, that elimination of that requirement be included in the phase 1 amendments. Now, the implications of that tie back to the schedule. So as I talked about, that committee is going to forward their recommendations to the full Planning Commission. The full Planning Commission may or may not decide to adopt that recommendation. Regardless of whether or not they do, whatever they do will get forwarded to the full city council, where then that if that recommendation is included, then that would be part of what people could comment on as part of the public hearing, and ultimately that the city council would act upon. So that, I think, covers most of what I wanted to say. I do apologize for that sort of last minute addition. I just learned about it myself today, but I'm happy to take questions. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen just so I can see faces. The way I'm set up in my home office doesn't allow me to do both a screen share and that at the same time.
Thank you so much, Josh. We'll open it up for questions now. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can put your hand up, whatever you want. We're a small group, so you can just talk. Any questions out there? You did a good job, Josh. I mean, I think that the good news is that I do feel like people are starting to get familiar with kind of like having heard it from, snippets from different places. I do think that this is becoming a more familiar idea to folks. But I think we always appreciate the opportunity to raise questions if we've got them.
Yeah, and that's great. Thank you, Maggie. And I'll share in the chat. This is in your agenda as well, but this is the long link to the zoning studies website. So we try our best to keep that up to date with information sort of on what's going on with the study, the timeline. You can subscribe for updates there. There's also we actually have a dedicated email address where if you do have questions or comments, you can send them. As far as comments go, you know, we can really, in terms of official comments, they have to come during a public comment period, and they either have to come at a public hearing or in writing during the public comment period. But you know, we're happy to try and answer questions for folks or take informal feedback as well.
Thanks. It looks like Rich has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm going to test this. Okay. So I'm trying to, a couple of things. So one is, so I'm trying to figure out how this becomes like in play, as it were. And I'm trying to understand, like, because part of it, a lot of ideas and a lot of options, and I'm trying to see how they all roll together, you know, and I, in some ways, I probably can't even think of all the questions I might have in the concept of how you know, it makes sense along major arterials with bus and mass transit. Maybe I'm concerned that, you know, are we going all in on putting back houses through the major metropolitan, the major residential R1 areas or something like that? And it's hard for me to filter out how that plays out. If you can, it's not a very easy question to be asked, but you know.
No, I appreciate you trying to articulate it. It's there's a lot there.
Yeah.
It is really complicated, and that question of like, how do you do this spatially? You know, for the phase one, that's sort of like you already have ADUs citywide, so it's tweaking that. The owner occupancy requirement is something which I expect will generate more discussion, but you know, for the most part, like ADUs are already allowed more or less across the city. Some of the proposed changes provide a little bit more flexibility. For the phase two portions of the study, where we think about things like, do you want to have duplexes in a lot more places? Do you want to have triplexes in a lot more places? That requires, I think, a lot more consideration, which is why we did this sort of phase one, phase two. And one of those questions, both from a policy standpoint, so like what is the best? What is the goal, and what helps accomplish it in terms of how we structure our zoning code? There's also on that space of the question, like a sort of an implementation question, right? So how do we actually make this happen? And those two questions work together. But I would agree, as staff, you know, I don't get to make the decisions. We're working with the planning commission, and then ultimately the city council does. You know, it may be that the majority of opinion says, well, no, let's restrict it to these certain areas where, you know, there's better access to transit, or, you know, whatever other factor. Because those are certainly things to think about. The counterbalance is sort of an equity argument. So, you know, if I don't happen to live on a transit corridor, but I'm okay with this, and, you know, there's general agreement that it won't seriously change the character of the neighborhood. You know, we thought about things like scale and, you know, how many people are coming and going, then, you know, why not consider other areas? So I can't answer all those questions. I can, and when I say me, I mean all staff. We can offer our professional opinions. We can help evaluate those questions. But ultimately, you know, my hope is that for public consideration, there's sort of the range of options, and then, you know, that's where the policy debate happens. I think it's certainly a fair question, because it is a, if nothing else, it's a pretty big paradigm shift, right? but on the other hand, has the way we've done it for X years helped contribute to the housing shortage? Very complicated question. I don't know. And it's all tied up in things like how, are we using land efficiently, right?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks. That's a good answer. I'm probably an advocate for doing some things and experimenting and learning and then iterating. That's,
Well,
So
that's
anyway,
fair.
that's my,
And that the conversation, we as staff will try our best to provide, sort of our analysis of all the factors, economic incentives, how neighborhoods differ, all those things that might help understand what, you make the change. Any sort of zoning study, I think I shared this point with a colleague earlier because it's universal. And I think I even mentioned earlier that a zoning change does not equal a land use change, at least in the short term, right? Zoning sets the rules, but it's a whole different set of factors that drive the land use change. So certainly we want to be thoughtful about what those factors are that are going to drive change. If you're changing the rules, you should do so with an understanding of what might the implications be. And when I say the rules, I mean the zoning requirements, but there are a lot of other factors. For the most part, and this is why we're working with consultants to help tease this out better. If I have a single family home and I could build instead a duplex on it, but I had to either do massive remodeling or tear it down and build a duplex, that there's a big financial consideration there, right? There's a lot of cost, and does it make sense? And the same is even true of an ADU. If you have to run another sewer line or water line, that's not cheap. So we are doing our best to understand those and how that interplays with this question of where is it appropriate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other question.
Do we know how many ADUs currently exist in St. Paul?
It is a known number. I would not feel comfortable saying what that number is because I don't know. It is not a lot. It's yeah. I don't want to offer range because I don't want to be drastically wrong. But I know my colleague Michael has looked at that very specific number, and it is if you think about the number of residential lots in the city, which is in the tens of thousands, it's several orders of magnitude lower than that. So it's and that's over again around 4 years. And hi Suzanne. Suzanne and I know each other from past work on issues.
Yeah, well, they're hugely expensive to build, and
Right.
I watched the webinar and that you have up, and part of it is that you have to have separate water and sewer lines, which is a function of the building codes. So seems like that's a big obstacle right there.
It is indeed. I agree. It's and that is a determination that's been made by the building official based on an you'd think something like the building code would be you either can or you can't, but there's a lot of things in there. So in Minneapolis, at least in places, they've allowed it based on an assessment of the condition of the water distribution and the sewer systems, that there's more risk in allowing additional connections and what that would do to the integrity of those systems versus the potential issues that you get where you have two structures using a shared connection. So I outside my area of expertise, but yes, I would agree with you. That is a huge cost because digging trenches is expensive. Even if they do the directional boring, yeah, it's a lot.
I'm curious what sort of data, if any, there is out there about the duplexes, the triplexes, the smaller rental units. Who owns those? Are they typically owner-occupied dwellings where owner lives in one part, they're renting out the other, or are they more often larger companies? Is there any data out there on that, or just anecdotally, do you know one way or the other?
Yeah, I'm gonna give a qualified answer. Like I'm not gonna write down that question and the number of ADUs question.
Sure.
The data isn't perfect. Homesteading data, and I don't know how universal this is, but at least in Ramsey County, is not real reliable. Because
Understood. Yeah.
because people don't have to, it's hard to catch
Right.
someone.
For sure.
There's a similar problem with the way we don't do rental licensing in St. Paul in the way that some cities do. And I don't
Gotcha.
know that having licensing would solve the problem anyway. But one of the key indicators, if you live in a single family home or a duplex, those are regulated in a different way than anything 3 units and above by building code. If you live in it, and well, I guess if you live in your own home, you can't rent it out. But if you live in a duplex, you can rent out the unit without going through what typical rental units do, which is called a C of O inspection, a certificate of occupancy, where
Interesting.
it's like combined property maintenance, health and safety, fire code. They do all those things. But we can't do a C of O, we the city, unless we know that it's rental. So I know that the folks in DSI do periodic sort of scans to see if they can pick up properties that they suspect might be rentals, and find an ad for rental or some other piece of information. So I will put that down to see what that number is. I suspect it's a combination.
Sure.
I know that one of the challenges with duplexes is because so many people own them as income properties.
Yep.
They tend to be priced as 2 houses. So it's a different pricing structure than if you're buying a single family home. But so I'm writing down number of ADUs and duplex ownership patterns. I would imagine that Michael, if he were here, would probably have a better answer for that. Because he's been doing that groundwork for us. But that is one of the questions that we were charged by the neighborhood planning committee with, and that we as staff, because that gets to this whole question of equity.
Right.
I think people would also argue that there's a higher propensity for deleterious effects on a neighborhood if you have someone who doesn't live there, has less incentive to manage it well.
Yep.
How broadly that bears out, I guess, probably depends a little bit on circumstance, and what you think about it depends on your faith in humanity. But but certainly one of the issues we want to understand. I will note that we're working with our attorney to understand what we don't currently regulate ownership of single family homes or duplexes. So I'm waving away a child. And I don't think we could legally. I think ADUs, because they're an accessory, are a different matter, and that's something we'll continue to look at with our city attorney's office, but just as a practical consideration.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the info. I learned things about how duplexes work right there, so that was really handy. One of the well, it wasn't one of the, it was the first place I rented when I moved here was a duplex in Dayton's Bluff, and the woman who owned the house lived next, in the other unit. To date, it's the best place I've rented since I moved here. It was a wonderful experience. She had that vested interest in the making sure the property was kept up. So that's
yeah.
That's
Oh
a good
thing. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think most people would see the logic in that.
Other questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay. Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate
Absolutely.
it. We'll continue to put out information about this in our newsletter and make sure to include that email address where people can provide feedback kind of as we keep going here. And we appreciate the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. And yeah, please stay tuned. And on those 2 questions, I'll see what I can find out and maybe shoot Shevik a note if that's all right, and he can pass it on maybe at your next board meeting or however you guys want to do it.
Yep, absolutely. We can follow up. Thank you.
One
All right,
more
well-
question, sorry. Will the slides be separate from the recording or not? Like,
You know what, I'll send them over to Shevik
thank,
so that you can flip through them. I assume that's what you're looking for. Okay.
Yeah, whatever Josh sends me, answers or slides or supplementary documents and links, I will include wherever this video gets embedded on our website, so it'll all be attached together.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shevik.
Thanks, Josh.
Appreciate it.
We appreciate
right,
your time.
Have a great night. And I'm very glad to hear that 1554 Midway sounds like actually being redeveloped, because that's been sitting there for a while. So great. Have a nice night, everybody. Thank you.